The alien woman covered my mouth and eyes with her hand. "Now remember who you are." She said David had always been fascinated by the unknown. He had joined the exploration crew of the Elysium in hopes of discovering new worlds and expanding humanity's reach into the stars. As a low-ranking officer, his duties were often mundane, but there was a sense of pride in knowing that he was part of something greater, a mission to uncover secrets beyond the known galaxy. One day, the ship received a signal from an uncharted star system. The message was strange, almost like a faint whisper in the void of space. After analyzing the signal, the crew determined that it was coming from a planet in a distant part of the galaxy. The planet, which had no name, was located in a star system that hadn't even been mapped. This was the kind of discovery David had always dreamed of. This was his chance to prove himself. After several days of travel, the Elysium arrived in orbit around the mysterious planet. It was breathtaking. The surface was mostly covered in vast oceans and dense forests. There were no signs of advanced civilizations, but the planet's beauty was undeniable. As the crew prepared to land, David felt a sense of anticipation in his chest. This was going to be different. This was going to be history. They sat down on a flat plain near the edge of a sprawling forest. The air was fresh, and the ground was soft beneath their boots. The planet seemed calm, almost too calm. It felt as though it was waiting for something. The crew quickly began their survey, collecting samples and analyzing the flora and fauna. There was nothing immediately dangerous, but there was a sense that something was not quite right. As they explored deeper into the planet's interior, David noticed something odd. At the base of a large cliff, hidden behind a thicket of trees, there was an ancient structure. It didn't look natural. It was like a temple, weathered stone pillars rising from the ground in a formation that suggested it had been built by intelligent beings. David felt a shiver run down his spine. This was not what he had expected. They hadn't been prepared for this kind of discovery. Curiosity got the better of him. Ignoring the warnings of his commanding officer, David decided to investigate. He ventured toward the temple alone, hoping to find something that would explain its origins. The structure was silent and still, as though the very air around it had been frozen in time. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, but they were too worn to decipher. As he stepped closer to the entrance, something caught his eye, a faint glow emanating from within the temple. Without thinking, he stepped inside. The interior of the temple was dim, with only the light from the strange glow illuminating the space. It was cool inside, and the walls seemed to pulse with energy. David moved forward cautiously, his senses alert. The glow grew brighter as he neared the center of the temple, and soon he found himself standing before a large, circular altar. It was there that he saw her. At first he thought she was a vision, someone from his past, perhaps a dream. The alien woman stood in the center of the altar, her eyes closed, her skin like polished obsidian. She was tall, elegant, and exuded an otherworldly presence. There was something about her, something familiar that made his heart race, but he couldn't place it. He had never seen her before, and yet it felt as though they had met many times in his life. She didn't move, but her eyes snapped open as soon as David stepped forward. They were not like the eyes of any human. They were a glowing violet, like the depths of a nebula, and when they locked onto his, he felt as if his very soul was being drawn in. For a moment, he could hardly breathe. Before he could speak, she raised her hand, gently placing it over his mouth and eyes. Her touch was cold, but it sent a strange warmth through him. "Now remember who you are," she said softly. David's body stiffened as he tried to pull away, but he couldn't. It was as if an invisible force held him in place, binding him to the alien woman's presence. A wave of images, feelings, and memories flooded his mind all at once. They weren't his memories, not the ones he knew, at least. They were from another time, another life. He saw himself, no Khazar, standing on a battlefield, commanding legions of warriors. He saw the galaxy stretched before him, his empire vast and powerful. There were flashes of battles, of victories and losses. Faces of allies and enemies passed by in quick succession, all connected to a life he could no longer remember. The images were overwhelming, too much for him to process at once. Suddenly, he heard the woman's voice again, though it was distant, like a whisper in his mind. "You've forgotten, but you are more than just a human. You are Khazar, a being of great power. You fought beside me once." David struggled to focus, but the memories kept flooding his mind. He saw the alien woman in the memories, Liara her name was. She had been his companion, his equal, and together they had led an empire across the stars. The memory of her touch, the way she had always stood by him, filled him with a sense of longing and loss. He felt an inexplicable bond with her, a connection that transcended time and space. But he didn't understand. He was just a human. He had no past like this. These memories were not his, were they? The force that held him still began to loosen, and David took a sharp breath, blinking rapidly as he regained control of his body. He pulled away from her hand, his mind spinning. Who are you?" he managed to say, his voice shaky. The alien woman's expression was unreadable, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I am Liara, the last of my kind," she replied. "And you, David, are not who you think you are. You are Khazar, a being reborn, and your past is not lost, only hidden." David's mind reeled as he struggled to comprehend her words. He was just a human. He was David, an officer on a routine mission. But the memories, the connection to this alien woman, felt undeniable. It was as if the truth was hiding just beyond his reach, and with every passing moment, it felt like his entire world was shifting. Liara took a step forward, her violet eyes never leaving his. "You've forgotten the power you once had, but it is not lost. You will remember in time." David shook his head, trying to push the strange thoughts from his mind. This can't be real. I'm just a man, just a soldier." "Not anymore," she whispered. "You are more than that. You are Khazar, and the galaxy remembers you." Before he could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. A low rumble echoed through the temple, and David instinctively reached for his communicator. Something was wrong. Something was coming. Liara's eyes hardened. "They found us." Suddenly, the walls of the temple shook with the force of an explosion. Dust and debris rained down, and David barely managed to duck behind a pillar for cover. The alien woman stood unmoved, her eyes glowing brighter, as if drawing power from the very air around them. "They won't stop," Liara said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "The Galactic Alliance has sent their forces. They're here to destroy everything we've built." David's heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. His life, his past, was not what he thought it was. And now the galaxy's most powerful forces were after him. "Come with me," Liara said, turning to leave the temple. "It's time you remembered who you are." David hesitated for only a moment before following her. Whatever lay ahead, whatever the truth about his past, he knew he couldn't face it alone. There was no turning back now. David felt as though he was walking through a fog. Every step he took, every breath he made felt foreign, as if his body wasn't fully his own. His mind was still spinning from what had just happened in the temple. Liara, the alien woman with the glowing violet eyes, had said that he was someone else, someone more than just a human. She had called him Khazar, and the memories that had flashed through his mind felt real, but how could they be? He was David, an officer on a human ship, nothing more. But the weight of the words, "You are Khazar," stayed with him, like an anchor dragging him deeper into an ocean of confusion. Liara moved quickly, her steps silent despite the rubble and dust around them. She was as graceful as ever, her presence both calm and commanding, but David could sense the urgency in her actions. He followed her as best he could, still struggling to shake off the feeling that the world around him was slipping through his fingers. The temple was crumbling, pieces of the stone walls falling away as though the very foundations were being shaken by some invisible force. They reached a narrow hallway that led to what looked like an underground passage. Liara's eyes flickered to him, her gaze steady. "We have to leave before they find us," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a fire behind it, an unspoken urgency that pushed David to keep moving, even though his body felt like it was weighed down by the gravity of what had just happened. David glanced back one last time at the temple, now only a shadow of what it had been moments before. It was as if it was falling apart, just like his sense of self. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't some mission gone wrong. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. The tunnel they entered was narrow and damp, the walls made of rough stone that seemed to hum with an energy David couldn't understand. Liara walked ahead, her movements fluid, as though she knew exactly where she was going. David had no choice but to follow her, unable to ignore the growing feeling that he was being pulled into something far greater than he could grasp. As they moved deeper into the tunnels, David tried to focus on the facts. The memories of Khazar were too much to process, too overwhelming. He had seen visions of wars, of empires, and of planets falling beneath his command. He had seen Liara beside him, a warrior, a queen. Yet when he looked at her now, he saw nothing but the woman standing in front of him, someone who had been waiting for him, someone who seemed to know him better than he knew himself. The deeper they went, the more David felt like he was slipping between worlds. The world he knew, the life he had lived for so long, seemed so distant, so unreal. But the memories, the flashes of a past life, felt so alive. It was as though a part of him was waking up after a long slumber, something he couldn't control, but something that was undeniably real. They came to a large chamber at the end of the tunnel, a space that seemed ancient, untouched by time. It was filled with symbols and markings that David couldn't read, but they felt familiar, like something he should understand. Liara stopped in the center of the room, her eyes scanning the surroundings with careful precision. "Why are we here?" David asked, his voice hoarse from the strain of trying to understand everything. Liara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to face him, her eyes softening for the first time since they had met. "This is where it all began," she said quietly. "This is where you were born." David stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. "I was born here, but I don't." "No, not as you are now," Liara interrupted gently. "You were reborn here, this place. It holds the key to who you truly are." David's heart raced as he tried to make sense of her words. Reborn, his entire life, everything he thought he knew had just been turned upside down. He had been born here, but why didn't he remember any of it? Why did it feel like everything was slipping through his fingers? Before he could respond, the walls of the chamber flickered with light. At first it was faint, like the glow of distant stars, but soon the light grew brighter, illuminating the room with a strange, otherworldly energy. David took a step back, his senses on high alert. Something was happening, something beyond his control. Liara raised her hand, and the light seemed to respond to her command, growing even brighter until the entire room was glowing with an almost blinding intensity. David had to squint against the light, but even then, the energy in the room was overwhelming. "It's time," Liara said, her voice low but filled with authority. "The past is waiting for you to remember. This is where you must unlock the power you have forgotten." David wanted to ask what she meant, but before he could speak, the light around them pulsed with a sudden burst of energy. His body went rigid, and his mind was flooded with visions once again. This time they weren't just flashes. They were full memories, his memories. He saw himself, standing at the head of a massive army, wearing the armor of an ancient warrior. He felt the weight of the crown on his head, the responsibility of an empire on his shoulders. He saw planets being crushed beneath his command, civilizations falling, and a galaxy torn apart by endless war. He remembered the fear in the eyes of his enemies, the way they cowered before him, and the way Liara had stood by his side through it all. Together they had been unstoppable. They had brought the galaxy to its knees, reshaping it in their image. But as the visions continued, something began to shift. The power, the overwhelming strength that had once been his, felt like a curse. He remembered the destruction he had caused, the countless lives lost. He saw Liara's face, full of sorrow, as they stood amidst the ruins of a fallen civilization. Her eyes, once full of admiration for him, now held something else, disappointment. "Why did we do it?" he asked, his voice echoing in the emptiness of the memory. "We did what we had to do," Liara's voice answered, not from the memory, but from beside him in the present. "But it was a cost we couldn't afford. You were too powerful, too consumed by your own strength. We lost our way." The vision shifted again, this time showing him something else, something even more terrifying. He saw himself standing before a group of alien leaders, his hand raised in command. The galaxy trembled at his words, and he realized that this was the moment when it all had started to unravel. His empire, built on power and fear, had begun to crumble under its own weight. David's vision blurred again, and the images faded. He was back in the chamber, gasping for breath as if he had just run a marathon. His head spun with the force of the memories, and for a moment he couldn't tell where he was. But as his mind cleared, he realized one thing: he wasn't just a human soldier. He was Khazar, a being of unimaginable power, a force of nature who had once ruled the stars. And now he had to make a choice. Would he embrace this power once again, or would he fight against the very destiny that had been thrust upon him? Liara was watching him, her eyes filled with something like hope. She had always believed in him. She had always known who he truly was. "You are not just David," she said softly. "You are Khazar, and the galaxy is waiting for you to decide what comes next." David stood in the glowing chamber, his mind reeling from the weight of his past, his future, and the power he could barely begin to understand. One thing was clear: there was no going back now. The path ahead would be one of fire and blood, and he would have to choose which side of the war he would fight for. Liara's gaze softened, but there was an undeniable determination in her eyes. "Remember who you are, Khazar. The galaxy is waiting." David's mind was still reeling from the memories he had seen in the chamber. He was Khazar, the once feared general who had brought an entire galaxy to its knees. The power, the strength, the memories of war, these things flooded his mind with such intensity that he could hardly think straight. He had always thought of himself as just a human soldier, following orders, doing his job, but now he knew the truth. He was something else. Something more, but with that realization came a heavy burden. The choices that Khazar had made, destruction, war, devastation, had caused untold suffering. And now that power, that same potential for destruction, had returned to him. He had to decide what to do with it. The world as he knew it had shifted beneath him, and every step he took seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 past lives. How could he make the right choice? How could he wield such power without repeating the mistakes of the past? Liara had watched him in silence, her expression unreadable. She had been the one to awaken him, to remind him of who he was. But now he wasn't sure what she wanted from him. She had always stood by him, but was she hoping he would embrace the past? Or was she trying to guide him away from it? She spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "You're struggling with the memories, David. Khazar's past is full of pain, but that doesn't have to be your future. You have the power to shape what comes next." David looked at her, his mind still swimming in the flood of images and emotions. "But how can I escape it?" he asked. "How can I be something different when all I can see is destruction?" Liara stepped closer, her eyes gentle. "You don't have to escape it, you have to accept it. You are both Khazar and David. You are the sum of all your lives, your choices, your actions. But it's not too late. You can be a force for good." David shook his head, his mind clouded with doubts. "I've seen what I did. I've seen the chaos, the people who suffered because of my choices. How can I ever make up for that?" "You don't make up for it," she said. "You move forward. You use the power you have to protect, to guide, to build. You learn from the past, but you don't let it define you." The words were comforting, but David still felt a deep fear. How could he be someone different from who he had been? How could he undo the damage he had caused when the echoes of that destruction were still so fresh in his mind? He couldn't change the past, and the thought of repeating it terrified him. But there was a part of him that wanted to believe Liara. She was the only one who had ever truly understood him, the only one who had stood by his side when the galaxy feared him. If anyone could guide him, it was her. And yet, he couldn't help but wonder, was she asking him to repeat the past in a different form? Was she using his old identity to shape his future? What if she wanted him to bring back the very empire that had caused so much pain? They stood in the quiet room for what felt like hours, the silence hanging between them like a heavy mist. David's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, distant noise, like the rumble of an explosion, followed by the sound of metal scraping against stone. His heart skipped a beat. The Galactic Alliance had found them. Liara's expression darkened. "They've come. It's not safe here anymore." Without another word, she turned and began to move swiftly through the chamber, heading toward the exit. David followed, his thoughts still tangled in the storm of his emotions. There was no time to question, no time to think. They had to leave, and they had to leave now. They moved quickly through the tunnels, the ground shaking beneath their feet as the explosions grew louder. David's senses were heightened, his body instinctively reacting to the danger. He could feel the energy in the air, the way the tunnel walls seemed to hum with anticipation. The Alliance was closing in on them, and it wouldn't be long before they reached the heart of the temple. "We need to get to the ship," Liara said, her voice urgent. "It's the only way we can escape." David nodded, pushing the doubts and confusion aside for the moment. They had to survive, and in order to survive, they had to get out of the temple. He could still hear the distant sounds of the enemy forces, and he knew they would be relentless. They wouldn't stop until they had captured or killed both him and Liara. As they made their way through the underground passages, David's mind raced. He had been forced to confront his past, to accept the truth about who he really was. But now, as the danger closed in, he was faced with a more immediate problem: survival. The past could wait. For now, he needed to focus on staying alive. The tunnel opened up into a small clearing, and David could see the distant shape of the ship in the distance. It was a sleek, advanced vessel, capable of long-range travel. It was their only chance to escape. But as they moved toward it, the sound of footsteps behind them grew louder. David's heart raced as he turned to see the first wave of enemy soldiers rounding the corner. There were too many of them, more than he had anticipated. They were armed with energy weapons, their faces hidden behind helmets, their movements synchronized and precise. Liara didn't hesitate. She reached out with one hand, her fingers glowing with energy. The air around them seemed to vibrate, and David felt a surge of power in his chest. He had seen this kind of energy before, when he had fought alongside her in his past life. This was the power of the ancient warriors, a force that could tear through anything in its path. Without warning, Liara unleashed a burst of energy that sent the enemy soldiers flying back. Their bodies slammed against the walls of the tunnel. But more were coming, and they were not going to stop. David stepped forward, feeling the strange power within him stir. It was time to stop running. Time to face the past, to face the power that had once consumed him, and to decide what kind of man, what kind of being he wanted to be. He closed his eyes for a moment, reaching deep within himself, drawing on the energy that had once been his to command. The memories of Khazar flooded back, and this time he didn't push them away. He embraced them. The power surged through him, and he felt the familiar rush of energy, the sense of control he had once wielded so easily. The next moment he was moving. He was faster than he had ever been before, his body a blur as he took down the advancing soldiers with ease. The energy crackled around him, and he felt the weight of his past pressing on him, but he refused to let it define him. He wasn't just Khazar anymore. He was David, too. He was both, and that meant he could choose his future. With Liara by his side, they cut their way through the enemy forces, their movements synchronized as they fought to protect each other. David could feel the power flowing through him, and for the first time he didn't feel afraid of it. He was no longer the man who had destroyed worlds. He was someone new, someone stronger. They reached the ship, and David quickly entered the cockpit, Liara following him closely. The ship's systems hummed to life as he powered it up, his hands moving with practiced ease. He knew this ship. He had flown it before, and now he was taking control of his destiny. As they lifted off from the planet, the sounds of battle faded into the distance. But David knew that this was just the beginning. The Alliance would continue to hunt them, and there were more battles ahead. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a pawn in someone else's game. He was David. He was Khazar. And he was in control. David sat in the cockpit of the ship, his hands gripping the controls as the planet below shrank into the distance. He could feel the tension in the air, both from the battle they had just fought and from the weight of the decisions ahead. The ship's engines hummed steadily, but inside, David's mind was anything but calm. He had fought and he had won, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There was more to come, much more. Beside him, Liara sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the view through the ship's window. She was calm, composed, as always. She had been through far worse than this, he knew. Her race had survived countless battles, centuries of war, and now she was here, helping him find his way again. But even she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. They both knew that their enemies were not far behind. They had barely escaped the temple, and the Galactic Alliance would be on their tail before long. David could feel the weight of the power inside him, the power he had once wielded with ease. It was like an old friend, a familiar force that he could call on whenever he needed it. But it wasn't the same anymore. It didn't feel like it belonged to him, not entirely. He wasn't just Khazar, the warrior general. He was David, too, the human who had been thrust into this madness. He had seen the destruction Khazar had caused, and he couldn't ignore it. The past haunted him, a constant reminder of the choices he might make if he gave in to that power once again. Liara broke the silence, her voice steady but low. "You're thinking too much." David glanced at her, surprised by her words. "I'm thinking." "That's all I seem to be doing these days." She gave him a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes thinking too much makes us forget who we really are." David turned back to the controls, focusing on the course he had set. He had to keep moving. There was no going back now. "And who am I then? Am I Khazar the conqueror, or am I David the soldier?" Liara's gaze softened, and she leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms. "You're both, but you get to choose which one leads." David exhaled slowly, his fingers running over the ship's controls. He knew she was right, but it wasn't that simple. It never had been. He had spent so long hiding behind his identity as a human soldier. The memories of his past life, of Khazar, had come crashing back in waves. Every time he used the power, every time he tapped into that ancient energy, it was like he was surrendering to something dark. It felt like he was slipping back into the role he had once played, and he wasn't sure he could stop it. But Liara was right about one thing. He had to choose, and that choice was coming faster than he had expected. The ship's alert system suddenly blared, pulling David out of his thoughts. A red warning light flashed on the control panel. He quickly glanced at the readout, his heart skipping a beat. They were being tracked. "They found us," David muttered under his breath. His hand instinctively reached for the controls, his mind already calculating their next move. The Galactic Alliance was relentless, and they would stop at nothing to capture him, especially now that they knew who he was. Liara turned her attention to the screens, her expression hardening. "We need to lose them. They won't stop until they have you." David's grip tightened on the controls. "How do we do that? We can't outrun their ships. We need a plan." Liara's eyes flickered with something sharp, something dangerous. "We don't need to outrun them. We need to make them think we're already gone." David's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled up a map of the star system, highlighting a nearby asteroid field. It was dense, filled with massive chunks of rock that could easily hide a ship. "We fly into the asteroid field. We use the natural terrain to cover our movements, confuse their sensors." David nodded, understanding the plan. It wasn't foolproof, but it was their best chance. If they could get into the field, they could hide and wait for the enemy to pass. He wasn't sure how long they could stay hidden, but they couldn't risk fighting. Not yet. He punched in the course coordinates, and the ship lurched forward, heading toward the asteroid field. The engine's roar filled the cockpit, and David could feel the ship accelerating as they moved closer to their destination. The field loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, the giant rocks floating like silent sentinels in the void of space. "Hold on," David said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. He had flown in asteroid fields before, but this would be different. They were being hunted. Every second counted. The ship entered the asteroid field, and David immediately began weaving through the massive rocks, his hands steady on the controls. He had flown in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. The memories of his past life, the battles, the armies, the destruction, played in the back of his mind. Every move he made now seemed to carry the weight of those memories. He could feel the power of Khazar pulsing inside him, urging him to fight, to take control, to destroy. But he wouldn't. Liara's voice broke through his thoughts. "Stay focused. They'll be coming for us, and we need to be ready." David nodded, his eyes fixed on the shifting rocks ahead. He pushed the ship to its limits, flying through the field with all the skill he had. He had trained for years to be able to handle this kind of situation, but it was more than just flying. It was about staying one step ahead of their enemies. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. The seconds felt like minutes, the minutes like hours. David's heart raced as he watched the sensors, his mind constantly checking their position, ensuring they weren't being tracked. Liara's presence beside him was a steadying force. She didn't speak, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the space around them for any sign of pursuit. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the enemy ships appeared on the outer edge of the asteroid field. They were close, far too close for comfort. David's breath caught in his chest as he watched them move past, their sensors sweeping the area. For a moment, it seemed like they were going to pass by without detecting them. David's fingers tightened on the controls, his pulse racing. He could feel the ship's engines straining as they slipped through the field, staying hidden among the asteroids. But then one of the enemy ships suddenly veered off course, its sensors flicking toward them. The moment of silence shattered. "They've spotted us," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. The enemy ship was coming straight for them, its weapons charging. "Get ready," Liara said, her tone serious. "We won't be able to hide much longer. We have to fight." David's mind raced. There was no way they could outrun them, and if they fought, it would draw even more ships. They were outnumbered, outgunned. But they didn't have a choice. He couldn't let the enemy capture them. He couldn't let them find out what he truly was. With a deep breath, David pushed the ship into a dive, weaving through the asteroid field with all his skill. The enemy ship followed, firing blasts of energy that streaked past them, narrowly missing. David could feel the power of Khazar stirring inside him, urging him to take control, to destroy. But he held back. He couldn't let it consume him. The asteroid field was dense, and the enemy ship was struggling to keep up. David used the terrain to his advantage, forcing the enemy to follow him through tight spaces, dodging blasts and making sharp turns. It was a dangerous game, but it was their only option. Liara's voice came again, more forceful this time. "We can't keep running. It's time to fight back." David's heart hammered in his chest. It was time. He couldn't avoid it anymore. He couldn't run from the power inside him. He reached out, drawing on the energy that had once been his to command. His hands moved with practiced precision as he tapped into that ancient force. The ship's weapons hummed to life, glowing with the energy he now controlled. He wasn't just David anymore. He was Khazar, and he had the power to turn the tide. With a single motion, David fired, sending a barrage of energy blasts straight at the enemy ship. The explosion lit up the darkness of space, and the enemy ship faltered, its shields flickering. David didn't hesitate. He fired again and again until the ship was nothing but debris floating in the vacuum of space. As the silence settled, David let out a long breath. They had won for now. But he knew it wouldn't be long before more ships came. They were still in danger. The galaxy was after him, after Khazar, and they wouldn't stop until they had him. But for the first time since this whole nightmare had started, David felt the ship drifted through space, the quiet hum of its engines filling the cabin. The danger had passed, but David knew it wasn't over. They had won this battle, but the war was far from finished. His thoughts were racing, but there was one thing that kept coming to the forefront of his mind: the power inside him. Khazar's power. The power that had been buried for so long, now returned and waiting to be used. David ran his hand over the console in front of him, still feeling the echoes of that ancient strength. He hadn't wanted to use it, not at first. But in the heat of the moment, it had come to him naturally, effortlessly. And now that he had tapped into it again, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was always with him, always just beneath the surface. Liara, sitting across from him, didn't say anything. She was watching him with her usual calm expression, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Concern, maybe, or maybe something deeper. She had known him as Khazar once, and she had seen the destruction he was capable of. He could only guess what she thought now, as he tried to reconcile this new identity with the one he had left behind. They were silent for a while, just floating in the quiet of space. The asteroid field had been a momentary refuge, but David knew they couldn't stay there forever. The Galactic Alliance would be sending reinforcements, and they would be hunting for him. They couldn't afford to be caught again. "We need a plan," David said, breaking the silence. Liara nodded. "We do. The first step is to make sure they can't track us. They'll be watching every move we make." David glanced at the star maps on the screen. There were a few places they could hide, places outside the reach of the Alliance, but none of them would be safe for long. He needed to think bigger, think beyond just running and hiding. "Where do we go?" he asked. Liara leaned forward, her gaze intense. "We need to find the old safe zone, the place where we first began. It's still hidden, but it's the only place they won't expect us to go." David didn't hesitate. He knew what she meant. The old safe zone, the place where he had first joined forces with Liara, where they had hidden after their last battle. It had been their refuge, their sanctuary. It was the one place in the galaxy where they could stay hidden long enough to regroup. He set the coordinates for the destination. It was a distant system, far from the reach of the Alliance, and it would take them days to get there. But they had no choice. They needed time to think, to plan, and most importantly, to figure out what came next. The journey was long and quiet. Days passed with little to say, as David and Liara each dealt with their own thoughts. The ship moved steadily through the vast emptiness of space, and David often found himself lost in the silence, his mind circling back to the memories of Khazar. The power that had once been his, the empire he had built, he couldn't forget it. But he also couldn't ignore the pain of that past. He had destroyed so much, caused so much suffering. And now the question lingered in his mind: could he change? Could he really make a difference in this galaxy, or was he doomed to repeat the mistakes of his past? It wasn't until they reached the old safe zone that David felt like he could finally breathe again. The system was isolated, hidden among a cluster of uncharted asteroids, the perfect place to lay low. They entered the atmosphere of a small, forgotten moon, landing softly on the surface. The area was barren with nothing but rocks and dust for miles, but it was peaceful, isolated, safe. David stepped out of the ship, his boots crunching on the dry surface. Liara followed, her footsteps quiet and light. She didn't say anything, but David could feel her presence beside him, a silent reminder that, despite everything, he wasn't alone. They stood together, staring at the barren landscape in front of them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say, nothing to do except wait. The safe zone had once been a place of comfort, but now it felt more like a prison. David knew that eventually they would have to leave. Eventually they would have to confront the galaxy and whatever fate awaited them. But for now, it was enough to simply be here, away from the chaos. "We can't stay here forever," Liara said finally, breaking the silence. David nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I know. We need to start planning," she continued. "The Alliance won't give up. They'll send more ships, more soldiers, and we need to be ready." David turned to her, his mind clear for the first time in days. He had known this moment was coming. He had known that hiding wouldn't be enough. The galaxy was after him, after Khazar, and no matter how far he ran, they would always be one step behind. "What if I don't want to fight anymore?" he asked quietly, his voice rough. "What if I don't want to be Khazar? What if I don't want to destroy?" Liara's gaze softened, and for a moment she didn't say anything. She stepped closer, standing beside him, her presence grounding him. "You don't have to destroy David. You don't have to be Khazar if you don't want to be. But you can't ignore who you are. You have the power to change things. You can use it to build, to protect, but you can't deny that part of you." David closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He didn't want to be Khazar, the destroyer, the ruler. He didn't want the bloodshed, the war, the endless cycle of violence, but he couldn't deny the truth either. He had the power, and with that power he could either create or destroy. "I have to find a way to use it," he said softly. "I can't change the past, but I can control the future. I can choose how to use this power." Liara nodded, her face serious but not without hope. "That's all any of us can do, choose." They spent the next few days preparing, gathering what supplies they could, and creating a plan. David spent hours going over star maps, searching for places where he could make a difference, places where he could begin to rebuild, to protect, to change the course of the galaxy. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The Alliance would come for him, and there would be battles, but this time he would choose what kind of battles they fought. He would choose to fight for peace, for protection, not for power. As they finished their preparations, David felt a sense of purpose rising within him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he knew what he had to do. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He wasn't just Khazar. He was David, and he would fight for the future. Liara stood beside him, her eyes shining with determination. "Are you ready?" David turned to her, his expression resolute. "I am." Together, they boarded the ship once more, ready to face whatever came next. David knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. This time, he would choose the future. As the ship lifted off, leaving the barren moon behind, David looked out into the stars, knowing that the galaxy was waiting for him. And this time, he was ready to fight for it.